Good afternoon. Welcome to St. John's Church, the beloved community. We are excited and delighted that you are here on that which is a Super Sunday, and even so super here that I hear a football game broke out somewhere, or will be a little later. My name is Starsky Wilson. I'm blessed to serve as pastor here at St. John's, here for just under 8 years, and we're excited that you have joined us this afternoon for a critical conversation, a bit of a rolling conversation that is going on across the nation. And so thank you very much for being here. My job is to play a bit of guide and or traffic cop to let you know how we'll be moving for this afternoon's conversation. Just a bit of logistics here. There are folks, if you have need to use restroom or anything, if you go out those double doors and down the stairs, there are restrooms there, or if you go out of either of these two doors, there are restrooms just at this corner. If you should need them, and there are wonderful smiling faces to help you with any of that, no matter which door you so choose. On today, we are blessed to have with us as we begin our work this month in honoring African American Heritage Month, and as well as kind of joining with our partners at Christ the King United Church of Christ, our sister church in North County, to lift two different things for the community. The first is this theme that we've noted, Redeeming America's Soul, where we have reached, for the sake of honoring African American Heritage Month, we have reached into the history of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and remembered their stated mission to redeem the soul of America. We think that fits wonderfully well with our speaker for today, who blessed us this morning in preaching and will share with us from his literary work this afternoon. We also, in this connection with Christ the King, remind ourselves of a work that we've done together called Reviving Justice, the opportunity to engage in a bit of a justice revival together, calling God's church into work for justice. And so today, this morning, while Reverend Wallis was preaching here, Reverend Jim Forbes was preaching at Christ the King, and because their worship starts a little bit after hours, Reverend Blackman and Reverend Forbes will be joining us in short order, and prayerfully even some of those disciples from Christ the King. And then on tomorrow night, we will be with them at Christ the King at 7 p.m. when Reverend Forbes will provide the annual Black History lecture at Christ the King. So we encourage you to be with us tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. at Christ the King United Church of Christ on Old Halls Ferry Road there in Florissant. We're pleased to note, now I know that Christ the King people are done with worship, because I see Reverend Sonia Van, one of the ministers there, Reverend Jenny Daniel, our conference minister here in the Missouri Mid-South Conference of the United Church of Christ, and Reverend Dr. Jim Forbes also coming in fresh off of preaching over there. So welcome to you all. We really want to have a conversation today. And we're pleased with the conversation starter who has joined us. Reverend Jim Wallis is, of course, a New York Times bestselling author, public theologian, speaker, and international commentator on ethics and public life. He recently served on the White House Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, and was a former vice chair of and currently serves on the Global Agenda Council on Values for the World Economic Forum. Jim is the author of 12 books. His most recent book, America's Original Sin, Racism, White Privilege, and the Bridge to a New America, was released just last month. And his most recent books also include On God's Side, What Religion Forgets and Politics Hasn't Learned About Serving the Common Good, Rediscovering Values, A Guide for Economic and Moral Recovery, The Great Awakening, Reviving Faith and Politics in a Post-Religious Right America, and God's Politics, Why the Right Gets It Wrong and the Left Doesn't Get It. He is the president and founder of Sojourners. He is a guide for many in this work. I shared with the congregation this morning, this will be the last thing I'll kind of narratively share. I met Jim in the midst of a rainstorm on the streets of Ferguson, South Florissant, outside the police department, where he was with a community gathered on Moral Monday of 2014. They're gathered to give witness to and to call for God's justice in a legal system. And there, as we noted to the congregation, there we were baptized perhaps together in those range for 4.5 hours, standing for God's justice. And over time, he is one who has come to this community to learn from young people, to see people in this community gather, and to invite church leaders from across the nation to be a part of this work by virtue of his presence and offering them an opportunity to both learn and engage. And so we're pleased that he is with us on today. Jim will provide some reflections from his book, America's Original Sin, Racism, White Privilege, and the Bridge to a New America, which is available in the narthex if you've not already gotten your copy. And then we will have local respondents. So I will respond, as will Reverend Wendy Bruner, the new pastor of Peace United Church of Christ, which folks at St. Johns are really, really excited about, by the way. So we look forward to seeing some of you on February 28th. And of course, our dear sister, Reverend Tracy Blackman, the pastor of Christ the King United Church of Christ and executive minister for Justice and Witness Ministries for the United Church of Christ. And of course, we will invite you into the conversation as well. And so with that, please welcome Reverend Jim Wallis.
Well, this is I'm thrilled to see a running conversation, so we'll see you all back tomorrow night at Christ the King for another version of this. It is a blessing to be here. I know preachers often say that, but it really is a blessing. Brother Forbes back there knows and believes what I'm about to say, which is I believe that pulpits can and are supposed to change communities and nations and history. That's what pulpits and congregations can do and are supposed to. So it is a blessing to be here in a church and tomorrow in another church where I believe Reverend Starsky Wilson and Reverend Tracy Blackman are two pastors that are changing things, and here's why. I say in the book that Ferguson is a parable. Baltimore is a parable. I was in Chicago last week with Reverend Otis Moss III. Chicago's been a parable. Twin Cities after that, parables. I think these pastors are taking our churches into a parable. Into a parable. Parables, Jesus told stories called parables to teach us the right lessons. So what are the lessons that we're learning as you're taking the churches into the parable of Ferguson, which is so revealing about the state of the nation? What does that look like? So I hope we get into that conversation, hearing from you two about maybe, you know, when I meet young people in places like Ferguson and Chicago last week, it's interesting how critics sometimes say these young people are unchurched, right? Or anti-church, right? What I find is often those young people's lives and their streets and their circumstances are what's been unchurched. So when we begin to go into those lives and streets and circumstances, the church can find itself again. I love it when you remind your congregation of where and how we met. It was in going to jail, right? I always say that people of faith should go to jail and then, because of their faith, and then talk theology in jail. So Reverend Strauss said this morning, this book is theology, and indeed, it is. And the more and more we have these meetings, these town meetings, pastors are saying to me, we've got to get theological here. Now, that doesn't mean we get theological in our heads and don't get down to action, because my notion of the incarnation is that in Jesus, God hits the streets. That's the whole point. So unless there's a street theology for our theology, it doesn't really mean much. The Greeks thought you learn things by memorizing and spitting them back. The Jews knew that you don't know something until it's become part of your life. You don't know it until it's become a part of your practice. So, I want to start by saying we are, in the context we're in, I did watch Meet the Press this morning. That's the nation's town meeting, if you will, all those TV shows. And they are obsessed with what I'll call the state of the race, the political race, the horse race. They're obsessed with the state of the race. What we are talking about today and tomorrow, last week in Chicago, Twin Cities, Baltimore, is about the state of race in America in 2016 and how that is already dramatically shaping the race, the political race, which none of them want to talk about. So how do we take the state of race into a conversation about the state of the race politics for the rest of this year? So, 250 years of slavery, 100 years of legal segregation and terrorist violence against black lives and bodies. 50 years of a civil rights movement, 7 years of a black president. Politics hasn't cleansed us of this, and as Reverend Stark said this morning, sometime you got to call a thing a thing. The title of the book is very intentional. America's Original Sin. Brian Stevenson, who wrote the foreword, says, slavery never ended, it's just evolved. Now in mass incarceration, in policing, in not just incarceration, but disenfranchising millions of black voters. So it doesn't end, it just evolves. We were in Montgomery, retreat led by Brian Stevenson just in December. And what struck me, Starsky, was how there now are even a few memorials to the civil rights movement. There's a Rosa Parks Museum now. But nothing that is a monument or memorial to slavery, where slaves were bought, stripped of their families, sold, abused, dehumanized. None of that is there. In fact, in Alabama now, they want to say Rosa Parks was one of us. Martin King was one of us. And one line said, Dr. King in partnership with the people of Alabama. My, my, my. My, my, my. So, the original sin is not just slavery. See, that's kind of easy now for a lot of, as well, Ta-Nehisi Coates calls Americans who think they are white. It's a good line. Americans who think they are white. Because slavery was behind us. It was back then, and I didn't have slaves, and my parents and family didn't. There was all kinds of slaveries before. There was, the Greeks were slaves to the Romans, and the Greek slaves tutored the Roman elite children. They were respected. Families weren't destroyed. They just lost a war, and they're slaves. But it was we, the British, and let me get it more personal, it was we, British and American Christians who said, what we want to do, intend to do to these Africans, to make them into chattel property, to create the biggest, most important economic resource for building a new nation. What we intend to do is something our faith says you can't do to human beings. So we're going to throw away Imago Dei, the image of God. Throw it away. And this slavery is the most venal form ever created to dehumanize and make less than human those who we're going to make into slaves. And then it's astounding to me how it's so powerfully prophetic. The Black Lives Matter movement strikes right to the heart of America's original sin, which was to found the nation on the founding principle that black lives matter less than white lives. We just start with all men are created equal, and now let's move toward a more perfect union. No. Foundational. Black lives matter less than white lives. And as we were talking last week in Otis Moss's church in Chicago, why are all these places UCC? It's interesting. They're all UCC churches. Dr. Moss, we were talking about this during those sermons last Sunday morning. How white supremacy and white privilege is just the modern day practice of white supremacy. It really isn't just an ideology. We created race as a social construct. There isn't anything. In fact, Professor Glaude, in his new book, Democracy in Black, talks about this whole idea of white or whiteness has to be killed, which is great language here, because whiteness is not just an ideology. From a theological point of view, it's an idol. And what do idols do? They separate us from God. So what we're dealing with here, those of us who are white Christians, is that whiteness, our identity as white people, based on a false social construct created to justify greed, is an idol that separates us from God. So our involvement in this movement is not just to help other people who have been impacted by race and therefore we can be helpful. No, this is about getting our souls back again as those who have been raised to think they are white Christians. Dr. Glaude and I were on Morning Joe together, and Joe Scarborough said at the end, well, I'm going to have to read this book to figure out what this means, the idolatry of white Christianity. Yeah, you better read that, Joe, and figure it out. The idolatry of white Christianity. That's what's at stake here, and then it gets very systemic. So, the parable of Ferguson has taught the nation a lot about racial policing, racialized policing. It wasn't just in Ferguson, but the parable here taught the nation more about that than at least white people had ever really seen or heard before. About a criminalized justice system, about a racially criminalized. So when Starsky Wilson, we had 50 faith leaders come and have a retreat with these two and these young people, and he described the history of this area, St. Louis, and how racialized ghettos don't just happen, they're made by policy, housing policy and economic policy. And so you had all these faith leaders who were against what happened in Ferguson and wanted to respond, but they didn't know all that history. And you came and you laid out the whole structural, historical foundation of that, which was very formative for all those faith leaders. So we have to go deeper into the language of sin and repentance. And repentance, just to be clear, doesn't just mean you're sorry. And an imam and a rabbi told me already on this tour that in both their traditions, the real meaning is like it is in our tradition. The real meaning is not to be sorry or hang your head. It's you're going in the wrong direction. You've got to turn around and go in a whole new direction. It's turning, which you this morning talked about in our conversation together. It's turning and going in a whole new direction. So the phrase, the bridge to a new America, which I invoke in this book, is about that new direction. Now let me say what I mean by that. Underneath this election campaign, underneath the failure of immigration reform, underneath the pushback to Barack Obama, underneath the deliberate campaign to suppress votes of racial minorities, underneath all of that is something that's happening in this nation that is the most important thing happening in the nation that nobody wants to talk about, which is by mid-century, we will no longer, for the first time, be a white majority nation. We'll be a majority of minorities. And that is the huge demographic reality that American politics is trying to avoid, deny, obstruct, veto, and turn back. That's the whole meaning of Donald Trump's campaign. The whole meaning. He began as a birther saying Barack Obama isn't one of us. He's an other. He's a Kenyan Muslim. Nothing wrong with being a Kenyan Muslim, but Barack Obama isn't one. And then he launches his campaign in the speech by attacking Mexicans, immigrants. Then he attacks women yet again. He's done his whole life. And then Muslims. And that's racial too. His attack on Muslims. So he is the candidate of white nationalism. That's what it is. That's why it's not his strength, his charisma. He is the candidate of white nationalism. And you can't get anybody in the media to talk about that. Chuck Todd never asked him about that. Tavis Smiley mentioned it on a morning show last week, and he got just attacked by Donald Trump. All he's saying is, why aren't we talking about this? Why is he being allowed to get away with this? I'm talking to black journalists in D.C., and they all tell me they can only get glancing blows in to this conversation. So how do we have that new conversation? And Brittany Packnett from here, St. Louis, I'm often quoting her on the row when she said to me one day, she said to a lot of you, we don't just need allies, we need accomplices. Accomplices. So in all these meetings, I've been really encouraged by how intergenerational they have been, how multiracial they have been, how interfaith and secular they have been, and how deeply the conversation keeps going. And at the end, what we're really saying is, how can we be accomplices, the Black Lives Matter movement, and changing the direction of this nation? And I've said that while I believe this is so systemic, and the book talks about Brian Stevens as turning warriors into guardians. Plato had this notion of guardians being a critical role. That's what police should be. Guardians, critical role, but not warriors. We talk about, Jim, the third Reconstruction, another book you ought to read, William Barber's new book, what he calls James Crow Esquire. James Crow, unlike Jim Crow, wears a suit and a tie. Or Jane Crow Esquire. And going in and deliberately disenfranchising whole populations of people. James Crow Esquire. How do we understand these things systemically? That's true, but I'm saying it also has to get personal. I'm a Little League baseball coach, been for years. My sons are now graduating beyond Little League, but every black player I've ever had had has a dad or a mom who has the talk with their son. How to behave and not to behave in the presence of a white police officer with a gun. How to behave. This is not just low-income black kids, some of the top lawyers in town, black lawyers, their kid has the talk too. Every parent who adopts, every white parent who adopts a black child, they have to learn to have that talk too. Different talks with their different kids. None of the white parents have had that talk with their son. And most don't even know the talk's going on. That here are the teammates of their sons or daughters or classmates who are having that talk from people, parents they regard as their friends, talking about sports and politics and all the rest. Until white parents care about the talk that black parents have to have with their sons, we're not going to get very far here. Or to put it in terms of the churches, until white Christians start acting more Christian than white. Say it again. Until white Christians start acting more Christian than white, black parents are going to continue to fear for their children. We've got to see it in that kind of way. I wrote the book, or decided to, after Trayvon was killed. Here's this young man, terrible story, and the whole nation knows, the whole country knows, that if my big 6-foot-tall son, Luke, now going to play baseball next year in college, same age as Trayvon, if he had been in Sanford, Florida, doing the same thing at the same time, exactly the same way, the whole nation knows Luke would have come back to me in joy, and Trayvon didn't and isn't going to college next year. That's got to get personal for us. Or this holiday we just had in England, my wife's a Brit, one of the first women ordained, Church of England. I'll just throw that in. So we're visiting our friends and family, and my 12-year-old is a larger than average 12-year-old, and told his family and friends that he's 5'7.5". Don't forget the half now. And he told them, and they said, "Jack, you're so big and strong and athletic looking." No one said you look threatening. Brian Stevens says young black men and black boys are presumed dangerous and guilty. No one did that with Jack. While we were there, while we were in England, the news came across the pond that the police officer in Cleveland who shot and killed Tamir Rice wouldn't face a trial. And so I'm sitting on a couch in London with my son Jack, reading the story, and the prosecutor says, well, he was a larger than average 12-year-old. He was big. He was 5'7.5". 5'7.5". Now, does anybody think that Jack Wallis, in that same park in Cleveland, even with a toy gun, by the way, Ohio has conceal and carry, right, with a toy gun, would have shot Jack Wallis, a white cop shooting a white kid, in 2 seconds without talking to him? It's white privilege. Or on the road, I'm getting a lot of pushback from people and say, what about affirmative action? I said, yeah, let's talk about affirmative action. I, as a white baby boomer, was a beneficiary of probably the biggest affirmative action program in our nation's history. After World War II, my dad was a naval veteran. He came back, and the veterans got a GI Bill, which is free education. FHA loan, which is our first house. The government made my family middle class. And our neighbor was all these 3-bedroom ranch houses with a veteran inside. And all the white veterans got that. And the black veterans didn't get it. My time, my generation, my benefit as a white baby boomer, the government, made my family middle class. We're talking over lunch. Now they want to do government cutbacks and government's bad, too big. When the perception is the government is serving low-income people of color, then we want to push government programs back. So here's an immigration story, and I'll close with this, then we'll open this conversation up. So the most important talk on immigration turned out to be to my son Jack's 5th grade class at John Eaton Public Elementary School in Washington, D.C. So they're studying immigration, and 2 dads were involved. One's an immigration lawyer, and I was at the time fasting with Eliseo Medina for immigration reform on the Capitol steps just outside. And so I came and I told the kids about 11 million undocumented people who couldn't get the medical help they needed or legal protection they might need because they're undocumented, and whose families were being broken up by 1,000 deportations every day. By the way, in Flint, another parable, racism is in the air we breathe and the water we drink, and undocumented people aren't coming to the door when government officials say, I'm with the Department of something and I've got water. They're not coming. So I told the kids about what was happening to all these people, and these 5th graders were incredulous. What? And here's what they said. They said, well, why doesn't the government fix that? Why doesn't the government change that? Have you talked to them? I said, yeah, we tried to talk to them. What do they say? They say they're afraid. Afraid? What are they afraid of? And then it hit me. I looked at this 5th grade public school elementary class. They are African American. They are Latino. They are Asian American. They are Native American. They are white. They are Maltese. They're Somali. And I looked at those kids and I said, they're afraid of you. They're afraid of you. Why are they afraid of us? I said, because they think you look like what America is becoming. You look like the new America. You look like what they're afraid of. And they said, why? Why are they afraid of that? And I said, because they don't think it's going to work. Tell me, how's it working? All the kids said, it's working great. It's really cool. I said, well, our job is to teach America this is really great and really cool. Heather McGee of Demos, one of the groups that co-sponsored us in New York, it's a very powerful think tank, but now activist organization. And she was the respondent, or one of the respondents, and she said, like Jim, I have been against American exceptionalism for a long time, of all the dangers that leads to. But I'm beginning to wonder if we could build this bridge to a new America, navigate these waters of the new demographic we are becoming, where privilege and punishment would not be the consequences of skin color. Privilege or punishment. Or what Eddie Glaude says, where we have democracy in black and brown and white. If we could get to that place, Heather said, maybe that would be, for the first time, genuine American exceptionalism. I agree with that. So for the first time, there's a version of American exceptionalism that I'd love to see. And I'll finish this by saying, as a preacher, I got to have a text, so I'll throw a text in here. What comes up every time we have these deep conversations and we begin to envision a different kind of future all around the room, and academics and activists and pastors and lay people and people who aren't people of faith at all but are drawn to this, and somebody at the end raises the question of hope. is there really any hope for this? And it gets even deeper then, you know. We can imagine this, like Walter Brueggemann, prophetic imagination. We can commit to it. And what the young Ferguson, Tracy was standing right next to all these young kids when they spoke to all these, some of them pretty prophetic church leaders who said, what can we do? And what they said was, what risks are you willing to take? That was their question. What are you willing to risk? That's the question before us, but then it still comes up, is there any hope? And I would just say that maybe our particular role or function or part in this parable as the faith community is to deal with that one. We're the ones who say, as Desmond Tutu taught me a long time ago, hope isn't optimism. Hope isn't a feeling. Hope isn't a personality type. Hope is a decision you make. Because of what you say, you mean, but by faith. A choice, a decision. Hebrews says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. It's hard to walk the streets of a lot of our cities and still see what we see. It's hard when a young man in Ferguson, young boy really, teenage boy, told me last year, I still feel like I'm treated like 3/5 of a person. Existential feelings of the 3/5 compromise. He's feeling, they ask me, what do I want? Or protesting, what do we want? I want an education. I want a job. I want a family. What does my boy Luke wants going to college next year? Wants an education, a job, and a family. Is there hope? Well, we're the ones who take that text in Hebrews and paraphrase it by the way we live and say this: hope means believing in spite of the evidence and then watching the evidence change. Thank you very much.
Amen. We thank Reverend Wallis for sharing with us the challenges that are placed before us. As we noted, we'll now have brief responses from myself, Reverend Bruner, and Reverend Blackman. I asked Reverend Bruner whether she wanted to go next. She said, no, you go next. So I will do what Reverend Bruner asked me to do. I will keep mine men first. Okay. That's one of the reasons why I had to own that you told me to go next, because somebody was going to point that out to me later, that the men went first. Right. I'll seek to respond to just a couple of points. Having had the occasion to read Jim's book and to provide endorsement, I'll first note my favorite chapter, Segregated Church or the Beloved Community, encouraging you to read there. But I want to kind of get at this from what I believe to be the challenge that we found ourselves in August of 2014, which is that ultimately, as we recall the events of the days, on August 9th, of course, Michael Brown lay on the ground for 4.5 hours, his body bleaching under the sun, and his mother crying out for her child, and his friends gathered around seeing the life drip from his body. And it was yet until, and I get people to stop me about the work that we've done in the Ferguson Commission. I remind people that it was a full month of August, a full month of September, a full month of October, until in November, the Ferguson Commission was convened as an official public political response that was not a militarized response. There had been responses before. It was on August 16th. In the well of a church, flanked by church leaders and politicians and police, that the governor called for a state of emergency and told the world that he would deploy troops on our children. It's important to remember the timeline and to remember these places, that it was in the church that that message was delivered to us. It is important to remember that it was not until October that it was stated that there would be a democratized response and an invitation to the community to raise their hands. And it was not until November that that body, including myself and Reverend Blackman, was commissioned. It was not until December 1st that that body began its work. And in between, what we had was a leadership crisis. We had a vast chasm of leadership that was manifest by the fact that just a few days before Michael Brown was shot, there was an election wherein a white candidate split loyalties in the Democratic base in order to, through support of unions, be elected to an office over an African-American office holder and over the objection of many African-Americans. And because that African-American leader in St. Louis County was effectively a lame duck, and because that white leader didn't want to touch anything such that he didn't break it before he bought it, neither of them acted. I remind people, I share with people more frequently now that the commission's work is over, that the first time I was actually asked about serving on a commission as related to a response to Ferguson, it wasn't from the governor, it was from the mayor. And it happened there in September. Because part of what was happening was folks were trying to figure out how to cobble together a response. You recall that the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in August asked the president to call for a commission. They asked several times and it never happened. What was happening was the mayor and the county executive were figuring out whether they could jointly call together a commission and pull together the resources to effectively support it. For the record, my first answer was no. That might have been the right answer. I say that persisting to suggest that this leadership crisis that we see on the political stage, this leadership that we see in public affairs, may call for the church to respond in different kinds of ways and to reflect on our leadership as well. Because in as much as we say that there may not have been an appropriate political or public response to this public expression and learning about the fissures and divisions of our own community that manifest, that articulate the manifestation of our values and policy, which reflect, quite frankly, a sin at the center of them. There was also, quite frankly, a leadership chasm writ large in the church. It's unfortunate. Tracy Blackmans of the world help us not to do our work. Because we're able to say, look at that wonderful leader of the church. Look at that magnificent leader of our tradition who is doing the work. Thanks be to God. It's kind of like we do evangelism. We appoint it to a committee like it's not the work of the whole church. So we outsource the work of justice. We believe it is a specialized work. Reminded of the story that Dr. Jeremiah Wright told at Eden Seminary in a gathering of alums. He was talking about the story of one of his grandson who was talking about the magnificent ministry of Reverend Freddie Haynes, and how he was enamored with him because he has this gift of being able to memorize his manuscripts. But it is also the case that his message always emanates with justice elements in them. And then this other minister came for this regular revival that Reverend Haynes would normally preached. And his grandson was talking to this minister because he had preached 3 sermons and never mentioned an element of justice. So he asked, this young man did, he asked the preacher, how is it that you had 3 whole sermons and 3 different services and you didn't talk about justice once? And the preacher said, well, that's not my ministry. To which the young man responded, in the gospel of Jesus Christ, social justice is not, what he said, is not a specialty in ministry, it's the essence of ministry. And so it seems to me part of what we have and how we allow to persist America's original sin, how we allow this original sin to manifest itself in a public articulation of values that then embed themselves in policies, like the restrictive covenants that we see in the St. Louis metropolitan community, or like the proliferation and fragmentation of municipalities that's driven by racism in and of itself, such that people could create enclaves and neighborhoods to keep other people out. And then, of course, we move our churches. We move our churches to follow that same movement of fragmentation. We being very close to us. And so we do that because I believe we have a leadership crisis ourselves. And some of that, I want to say just in my brief moments here, calls for some of what Jim calls for in the book, storytelling, so that we might connect with one another over the fissures of our fragmentation, and truth-telling, such that we may own our own history and recognize where we have come from before we attempt to get to reconciliation. And maybe then we will find something to go back to that is worth reconciling for. Because most of the times when we say this, we're talking about some 1950s reality of America where certain folks didn't count. And so I think on this leadership perspective, for the sake of getting into the truth-telling and storytelling that will help us to be God's people, it has implications for our pastoral pictures, our pastoral preparation, and our pastoral practices in the life of the church. I apologize for the alliteration. I'm really a Baptist preacher in UCC clothes. Affirmed in both traditions, just for the record. I wrestled with this question earlier this week with some folks at a seminary, and so I want to kind of lay out these responses I want to suggest to us. As I consider our pastoral pictures, I risk, Reverend Wallis, the fact that one of my Old Testament professors is in the second row. Old Testament images of leadership center around a triplex plus one: priest, prophet, king, plus sage. Perhaps not as much sage, because sage tends to be a feminine image and we don't like to kind of relate to that conversation. As we consider these leadership roles, we must be thoughtful about these pictures of priest, prophet, and king, but also think about the things that come with them, the practices that connect with them. In the priest, we must learn proximity, presence with those who are most marginalized, and practice and develop skill sets of radical listening and real, true pastoral care that is not just individualized or individualistic, but rather considers care for traumatized communities wherever we find them. That the power of leadership in the moment has to do with this capacity to connect, to illustrate proximity and care through priestly presence in our communities. Pastoral preparation must include intentionality about this action of radical listening. Not only that, I think we must also consider, as we consider the role of prophet, we must open up ourselves to new kinds of modes. It was in the introduction to prophetic imagination that that Walter Brueggemann suggested that this old model of prophet versus king is increasingly difficult to pull off and less effective. There, I want to suggest that part of what we've got to learn is to engage in practices of participatory democracy. Not just congregational governance, which quite frankly we don't do all that well either in most of our churches, but participatory democracy would suggest that we must develop the charism and skill sets and practices around community organizing, such that we may help people who are directly affected by issues and challenges speak to these issues themselves, articulate and translate their trauma into the language of the public square. As we consider the role of king, we here don't talk about as much becoming kings ourselves, of course, building ourselves up to sit in chairs that look like thrones. A young child who wasn't very churched, didn't come to church a lot, visited us one time, and on the way out the door as I was shaking hands because I was sitting in one of those chairs, he asked me, "Now, are you the king?" And my wife said no. Although she did spend 10 minutes telling him that she was a queen. As we consider the role of the king, we're really talking about those who make laws, regulations, ordinances that guide our lives and our collective connections. Here what we're talking about is the practice, the direct engagement in public policy. I pause here to let people know that there are only 4 explicit calls to action in the Ferguson Commission report. There are 189 calls to action. There are 4 under racial equity. One of them is an explicit call to the faith community to engage in public spaces and public policy dialogue and conversations, to directly, to consistently engage school boards, boards of aldermen, councils of governance with their voices and their faith perspectives. We must practice public policy. Here, we've got to develop skill sets and charisms that are relatively basic. So I apologize for being so basic, but we got to learn stuff like Robert's Rules of Order. This sounds real old school, I'm sorry. I tell people I learned at the age of 12 years old at Union Missionary Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, Robert's Rules of Order on Saturday morning in the youth department. And they came in handy when we were doing this commission work, because I didn't know I was going to co-chair a commission ever. But when I found myself in a day-long meeting where we ended up spending over an hour, where people who were related to different business communities were trying to hold back and trying to stop the call to action to increase the minimum wage, it was very important for me to know that I only needed to get certain things out of that committee and that I could do other things when it came to the commission. And so out of the committee came a long action that I can't really remember. It was about a paragraph long, Reverend Beckman. But the first part of it was a recommendation to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour. The second part said, if it can be indexed against something, and only if the state revenue goes up a certain percentage over a particular course of time. I just knew, I'm fine with, we can pass it just like that, because when it made it to the commission, a well-placed motion lopped all of that off after $15. And in order to engage in the work of public policy, it's one thing to be able to preach and proclaim, but we also have some skill sets and charism to illustrate leadership where these kinds of negotiations are going on that can be taught in the church for the sake of the church, particularly if you have congregational polity, but also for the sake of our work in public witness. And finally, and perhaps this is an appropriate place to land with the sage, a pastoral picture must include the sage even more so, this woman of wisdom in the context of our spiritual lives. And pastoral preparation must be intentional to prepare us as well for the practices of prayer. It is one thing to engage in this work of public policy. It's another thing to engage in participatory democracy. It's another thing to do so with proximity and presence. It's another thing to be undergirded with spiritual disciplines of prayer, of fasting, of study, of fellowship in community. I close by noting this, and as much as we talk about, I came to this church and it looked quite different, and it had different kinds of challenges. We continue to have our challenges, quite frankly. I asked Brother William Curry, who's been going to this church almost 50 years, there standing outside on the Lee Avenue steps on a Saturday afternoon. So William, what's it going to take to turn the church around? What's it going to take to get over the stuff that we're really dealing with? We were dealing with some stuff right then. He said, Reverend, fasting and prayer. And as much as we engage a sin that has now been named, it will require us to develop the spiritual disciplines and capacities to undergird the practices that we learn for the sake of leadership. This kind does not go out without fasting and prayer. God bless you.
That's why we're at the end, because we're the sages, right? We're the feminine sages that people don't want to listen to all the time. I'm Wendy Bruner, and this is St.Johns is my home congregation. This is where I spent a good chunk of my time while I was in seminary, and I'm now the pastor of Peace United Church of Christ up the street just a wee bit. So now I don't have to yell. Up the street just a wee bit, but it is good to be home again, not only here in St. John's, but in St. Louis. It's just very good for me to be home. So I'm grateful to be here. And you know, I'm also going to paraphrase a psalm, and Clint, please don't correct me. He's like the psalm guru, right? Who are we that you created us a little lower than God, crowned in glory and honor, all of us created in the image of God? And I think that's something that we tend to forget. I remember where I was on August 9th. I was not here. I was driving home 27 hours to South Bend. That's where I was living at the time, from Arizona, because I had spent 7 days on the Mexico-Arizona border. And I had an opportunity to meet some folks there who had just been deported from this country. Their skin was brown. One fellow that I met had lived most of his life in Alabama. And he had 2 jobs, had a car and a house and a family. And one day he was driving along the street and the police picked him up. And before he knew it, he was in Arizona. You know how far Arizona is from Alabama? And then he was deported, and the deportation line is like a cattle chute. And you start in one place and you literally go down a cattle chute and you end up on a gravel road in Mexico. And before he was deported, his debit card was taken and destroyed. So he had no money, he had nothing but the clothes on his back, and it had been some 20 years since he had actually been in Mexico, and it certainly wasn't on the Mexico-Arizona border. And I wish I could tell you that that was the only story I heard while we were there for a week, but it was not. It is amazing what we do to people who we don't know, who we don't look like. And we call ourselves Christians and quote passages like the one from Psalm 8 that I just spoke of. And we say we believe it, but we don't really. So I stand here as a white person of privilege to say that I think one of the things, and Reverend Wallis, you mentioned this in your book, that relationship is key. Because if I know you, I might dislike you, but I'm not going to hate you because you've become a human being to me. But the other piece is that I'm going to listen to your story. And perhaps more important than listening to your story, although that is crucial, I'm going to believe your story. So you're not going to have to explain it too much. I'm not going to say, oh no, that did not happen. I'm going to believe your story. And I am going to care about you enough that I will not, at the end of the day, be able to walk away from that. And many of us, I think, have that privilege, don't we? So I work at what I'm doing. I say I'm working on the issues, whatever that is, race, whatever. And at the end of the day, I'm weary, and I go home, and I put up my feet, and I say I'll start again tomorrow. Where my brothers and sisters don't have that opportunity because they live that experience every day, all day. And I need to recognize that until I cannot walk away anymore, nothing will change in this country because we will be able to walk away. I'm going to tell you one more story and then I'm going to sit down because I just don't have that much to say, and Tracy's going to come next. So, and I'm going to lean on you. No, that's not true. I remember a number of years ago, not that long ago, my husband and I were in the parking lot at Schnucks on Lindell. My husband is African American, and my son was in the car, and he was being less than, what's the word? Well, he was misbehaving. You know, as little boys do. I don't even know what he was doing. But we decided we didn't want to take him in the store because it would just make grocery shopping miserable. And it's not the greatest task in the world anyway, right? So I said to my husband, you go in and I'll stay here with Tyson. And I handed him my debit card. And as I did that, that's the other thing that's really interesting, that my husband can use my debit card and nobody looks, but that's just that's something else. But the police stopped. And they asked me if I was okay. And I remember feeling angry and very sad that the police would have asked me that question. But I can't imagine how my husband felt when the police stopped him to ask if he was doing something to me, his wife. When we can't walk away anymore, things will change. As long as we can walk away, things will not change. And until we get to know one another, that will not happen. I will also just say, today I was preaching about, what we preach about in church on Sunday. Love, Jesus, all of that. Well, anyway, so well, we should, but I was quoting Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and he said in his letter, he said that we, the church, he was really tough commentary on the church. And because the church wasn't doing anything. Little has changed, unfortunately, but the church wasn't doing anything then either. And he said, right, that we needed not to be the thermometer that measured what was going on, but we needed to be the thermostat that controlled and pushed what was going on. And I think until we do that, things will not change either. And I think that as a church, as a faith community, we need to really realize that. And to talk about things is one thing, but to do things is another thing. And that's risky, and it makes us vulnerable, and people won't like us, and we might go to jail, and all of those things. But I think until we do that, until we can't walk away anymore, nothing will change. And so I would just leave us there thinking about those things. When will it be that we cannot walk away? And that we have to stand up and say something and do something so that systems will change and that people actually will realize and be recognized, all of us, as human beings, a little less than God, crowned with glory and honor, each one of us, no matter what. Thank you.
So I am aware that it is dangerous to stand between people and their Super Bowl. So it's a setup. I love the church, all of the church. I come to the United Church of Christ by scenic route. I started in Southern Baptist Church in Alabama, migrated to Catholic Church because of grade school, then migrated to Episcopal Church because of middle school, fell in love for the first time and migrated to Pentecostal because of a guy. Somehow migrated from Pentecostal to Lutheran Synod. Saw the light. Migrated to African Methodist Episcopal, where I accepted a call to preach. And after enduring a grueling process there, 3 months from the finish line, found myself in a UCC congregation. So UCC holds many meanings for me, one of them being utterly confused Christians. However, I love the church, all of the church. And so when I first received Jim's manuscript, I was struck by the title, Our Original Sin. You see, I have learned that we don't all experience church the same. We don't all share the same theology, even when we share the same space. But I told you my journey because I am one who grew up with a theology of original sin. And as we approach this Wednesday, which is Ash Wednesday, It is a time set aside to both mourn the crucifixion and the death of Jesus, and to rejoice in the hope that they could not kill him. And I learned as a little girl that because of that moment, that I was liberated from original sin. That I did not have to bear the cost or the burden of original sin. And whether you don't believe that theology at all and there was never original sin for you, or whether you were taught like I was that that is a real thing and that the death and resurrection of Christ has made it right, I invite you into this crossroads that Jim's title invited me into, because if original sin is no longer a burden that we have to bear, then I must ask the question, why are we holding on to it? Whether you see that original sin as racism, or whether you see that original sin as our desire to be God, why are we holding on to it? That was the first question that I was struck with in this book. And I'm grateful, Jim, that you took the time to write it. And I'm grateful that you wrote it as a white man, because quite frankly, I'm sick and tired of telling the story as a black woman. I'm glad to have an accomplice, several, if I'm honest about it, who are willing to tell the story from a lens that I really can't tell it as well from, and who I cannot be heard as well from. And I'm glad that he put it in God talk, because it does not allow us to escape the fact that if we are still living under original sin, it's because we are not willing to put it down. That was one of my realities from this book. He talked about in the foreword when Brian Stevenson said, racism has never left us. And so the parables he tells of Ferguson and of Baltimore and all the places that are recent are just a part of the legacy that has continued on and on and on and on. It's just a part of the story that we continue to tell. Racism has never left. Racism has changed. It has gone from being slavery to being legislation, to being Jim Crow. It has changed its look, but it still exists. And so when people talk about racism, they talk about how it lives and how it's thriving because it adapts to its new situations. But when people talk about the church, we talk about it dying. I can't be the only one that's heard that. The church is declining. The church is dying. Churches are closing. We don't feel that we can do any more ministry in this neighborhood. I don't get that. I know some of y'all get it, but I don't get it. And I am suggesting to you that perhaps what the church must do is learn how to change too. I am suggesting that when our buildings become our identification as church, it is time for church to leave the buildings. I am suggesting to you that this was never meant to be our comfort zone or our barrier from what's really happening in the world. One of the most often questions I'm asked no matter where I go is, where was the church in Ferguson? Where were we? And I used to hang my head in shame about that question because I knew what they meant. But then I remembered an immersion trip that I took to Ghana. I remembered Eden Seminary preparing me for that trip. I remember Eden Seminary specifically deprogramming me from thinking I was going on a missionary trip. I remember them spending a great deal of time making sure that I understood that I wasn't taking God anywhere. That God was there before I got there, and God would be there when I left. And so the question became, where do you see God? And I drew on that wisdom in Ferguson. And I stopped looking for the church and started looking for God. And I found that God, and henceforth the church, was alive and vibrant in Ferguson. The church had just left the building. The church was present in the way the people in the street who may not ever have considered themselves to be church folk, and they aren't because they get to define themselves, but very much lived a life of fellowship and a life of caring for one another, and lived a life of practices that we say that we're all about. And so I saw church when I saw Mama Cat pull up in a truck and set up tables in a parking lot and put linens on a table and bring out loads of food that she had spent all night cooking, and paper utensils, and in the parking lot across from the police station say, whoever is hungry, come and eat. That was communion for me, in a way more sacred than most communions on Sunday morning. I saw church when I saw a young little boy who had found himself living on his own since he was age 10. And our social services systems had not picked him up. And I suppose it's a good thing, since now that I'm listening to the hearings from last week, where we've placed undocumented children in homes that we didn't check out, and now they are caught up in sex trafficking. So perhaps he was safer outside of our system. But he found someone he could call mom and someone he could call dad in the movement. And I watched them reorganize their lives, because they weren't a couple, to share responsibility for this boy, to shift him from house to house and to pay for his clothes and to make sure he had an allowance and to give him his first birthday party ever at the age of 16. I saw the Samaritan story. I saw this in the streets of Ferguson. So I'm grateful that Jim has captured these stories for us. And I'm grateful that he is telling them from a place of privilege. And I'm grateful that we are all here together listening. But my question remains: if indeed we remain burdened with original sin of racism, and we do, why? Post-resurrection, post-new life, post-death and burial? Why are we refusing to let it go? A difficult question, and one I suspect I will wrestle with for some time. But until we wrestle with it, Jim will have to build volume 2 and volume 3 and volume 4. And we, sadly, will not live into who all God has called us to be until this skin becomes just a container and our spirits truly connect. Thank you.
So it's our sole desire to have a conversation about these themes that have been lifted. Maybe some of you have already picked up the book, begun to read, or you have questions about its content. We invite you to the microphones that are here in the aisle and invite you to join us in this conversation based on the starters here or whatever has started you as you came here. Thank you. We'll share a little bit your name, what brought, a bit about you as you share your questions with.
My name's Craig Scandrett Leatherman, and I appreciate your question, Reverend Blackman. That's where I felt this year the struggle and the shift and the question of kind of where is the church? And I remember on a morning march that you participated in, or a part of it in, I remember there were some people here in the front leading a song, Were You There? This was on Holy Saturday. And it was also the anniversary of the execution of Martin Luther King Jr., which those two had never coincided. And the march was led with a moving horn, and at that point the song was "Were You There When They Crucified My Lord?" And we had edged out into King's Highway, and the police were yelling at us, "Get off of the streets or you're subject to arrest!" And they kept making that announcement, and the protesters were saying, "Whose streets are streets?" And that represents to me the space that I live in, I move in and out of it, right? Because I don't have to be there. It's this optional space that I keep trying to be in. And I'm not sure what my question is, or response is, but that I do feel like, when I read the end of the book, there is no temple. And I still feel like even in this sacred space, and I was in Reverend Blackman's sacred space this morning, made especially sacred by Reverend Forbes' preaching, that these are sacred spaces. But somehow I feel like the places where we are bound together are not in these buildings, and that we really need to find new spaces. As I'm actually an anthropologist and got into anthropology because of missions, and I remember Paul Hebert saying that the church is where there's scripture, at least Christian church, the Holy Spirit, and cross-cultural witness. And I feel like we need to reimagine. I keep going into these settings where it's either predominantly white or predominantly black, predominantly middle-aged or predominantly young. And my head just keeps, I don't understand how God could bring that all together. But anyway, the beloved community is an image for participating in original sin. And then the question, or the the place where we have these conversations. I think that's a major part of Jim's thrust, that we have these conversations. And I feel like it's a place between and outside of churches, maybe hosted sometimes by churches, but where we find our repentance and where we find.
So, Jim, you write about this, you make this call to storytelling and truth-telling together. And you say a bit about beloved community. You want to kind of speak to this, how you imagine, how you talk about those in the book, these conversations you're calling us to?
I'm still going to, I'm just hanging with Tracy's question, why we hang on to our original sin. And I'm going to walk out with that. Why do we keep hanging on to it as white Christians? We're hanging on to our original sin. I mean, having grown up in the environment I grew up in, they talked about sin all the time and how Jesus saved us from it. You know? When I was 6 years old, my parents made me sit in the front row for a Sunday night revival preacher because all the unsaved kids had to sit in the front row. Because the closer you are to a sermon, the more impact it will have on your life. And so he was fiery and he pointed his finger right at, it felt like right at me. And he said, if Jesus came back tonight, your mommy and daddy would be taken to heaven and you would be left all by yourself. It got my attention because I realized I'd have a 5-year-old sister to support. So I asked my mother how to fix this, because she's good at fixing stuff. She told me about not the wrath of God, but the love of God. God loved me and wanted me to be his child, so I signed up. My first conversion. Second conversion was when I'm now 15, I'm listening in my city of Detroit, I'm reading the newspapers, hearing the news, and I'm asking questions. And something really, really big seemed really, really wrong, and nobody would talk about it. In my white church, my white school, my white world, no one would talk about it. So I went into the city to try to find out why we live the way we did in white Detroit, and life seemed so different in black Detroit, just like a few blocks or miles away. I came home with new answers and new friends that neither were wanted. And this elder in the church said, Jim, you have to understand, Christianity has nothing to do with racism, that's political. And our faith is personal. And I'm a teenage kid, and that's the night that I left, in my head and my heart, enjoying the movements of my time. Came back to faith. But I didn't have words to go around that then, but I did later, which is God is personal, but never private. And that's what Starkey was saying about taking your faith public. If we don't take your faith public, my view of the incarnation is in Jesus, God hits the streets. That's what it means. So why are we sticking with that old sin that we keep saying we're freed from? Well, one reason is to the stories question. I don't care much about surveys, but this one struck me. It was after the book was finished. Here it is, 72% of white evangelicals, white Catholics, and white mainline Protestants, 72% believe that the police shootings of young black men are, quote, isolated incidents. That's what the survey says. While 82% of black Protestants believe they are, quote, part of a pattern and part of their lives. Listen to that. This is like 2016. That racial divide. That's what this book is written into, that kind of divide. Why? Are the white Christians saying, they're making it up? They're just lying. It's more, they just don't know or hear or believe the stories, the experience, the lives of their black brothers and sisters. So there's a story in the book about, remember, some of you are old enough to remember Rodney King and how there's this video of him getting beat up by this cop. There's a trial in Simi Valley, and so the World Council of Churches sent someone out there to be a commission to find out what happened in the Los Angeles riots, as if we needed, to learn that again. But I went out there and we had a dialogue in Simi Valley, which is an affluent community, but a black Methodist church and a white Methodist church in Simi Valley, both affluent, had never talked before. Never talked, so they had a dialogue. So here's this black mother, and she says, I get so concerned for my son, who is in Los Angeles Police Department cop. When he takes off his uniform, I get scared for his safety. And a white mother says, oh, I can feel that fear for your son when he would take his uniform off and exposed to those gang members. The black mother says, no, I'm not afraid of the gang members. I'm afraid of the white LAPD officers and how they'll treat my son when he doesn't have his uniform on. Now, I saw this white woman who was utterly astonished by that testimony. She just couldn't believe. She just couldn't imagine. But the question was, would she believe it? We're sitting in silence, and we're all looking at these two black and white mothers. Would the white mother believe the story of the black mother? Bless her heart, she did believe the story. And the whole conversation opened up. Because, how'd you put it so well? Their skin colors became containers, and they listened to each other's spirits as mothers and stories. We are so blinded by our racial geography. King said it well, 11 o'clock Sunday morning, most segregated time. I did the research. No one had even done research on this, about alleged multicultural churches. No one had done research until 94. They discovered that 6% of our churches in the country had, the criteria was 20% of the congregation was from a different than the majority race. Now it's 13%, growing, doubled, but 13%. It's not just 11 o'clock, 9 o'clock on Monday morning when kids go to school. 6 o'clock dinner time when families have dinner. Who do your kids have play dates with? Sleepovers with? Who do you have dinner with? Who's in your house? Whose thresholds do you cross in your life? Not to talk about race, but to talk about kids, your life, your problems, your fears, your hopes. Where are we doing that in the body of Christ? Inside, outside, alongside? Where are we challenging the racial geography, which starts to illuminate so well in this town, is totally based on policies that are rooted in sin. You're saying policies that make churches say they can't do anything anymore, they can't stay, they can't help, they got to move. Policies rooted in sin create our racial geography, which makes us unable to hear and trust and believe each other's stories. So I think to really get at the sins of the policies, we're going to have to build those relationships where we trust each other's stories. And so that's maybe a big issue for the faith in getting our own house in order if we're going to be participating in participatory democracy.
Thank you. This woman here, no question at all.
Hi, my name is Danielle Harrison. I want to speak to the hope and our accomplices. I am the only African American person at my job, only African American woman I work at a white Catholic high school. And I find it very interesting lately, especially the timing of the Fox show now, The People versus OJ, and the conversation that's been coming up around that. And I see hope in that. We had this opportunity 20-some years ago when that decision came out and they had a split screen and they showed the African Americans cheering and the white people crying when the verdict came out. And people said they couldn't understand why. And I remember saying, it's not about whether he was guilty or not. It's something much deeper. And we tried to have this conversation, but white people got so caught up in I can't believe that we allowed this man to get away with it, that we missed the boat. And so I just see that right now, God's saying, look, here's another opportunity. And it's sad that we've had to, as people of color, we've had to keep telling the story over and over. But I am thankful that some white people are now getting on the boat and an understanding, because I had a colleague come in the other day and said, I was listening to NPR and they were talking about the anniversary, and I finally understood that why African Americans were excited, because they were cheering about the unjust racial criminal justice system, and that somebody was able to beat it. It wasn't about whether he was guilty or not, but because he was able to succeed where so many had not been able to. And I was like, thank you, Jesus. Somebody's getting it. And so I also want to say, again, as a black woman who is always being asked to tell her story, thank you so much. Because I say all the time, nothing's going to change until you, as a white man, tell the story, or you stand up and you don't walk away. I can do this until I turn white, and no one is going to listen, as much as you, as a white person, already saying, this has got to stop. So, thank you.
Other burning questions? I want to give, if not, I want to give Jim a chance right now to deconstruct this whiteness piece, because I think it's assumed and you kind of move quickly through it. But I think I best heard it explained, I think it was Otis Moss at the summit. You all were in dialogue. And it was this idea that white people don't become white until people of color show up. That before that whiteness is this social construct. That before that, and maybe in an all-white church, white people aren't really white. Some of them are German, some of them are Swedish, some of them are, right? So this idea of whiteness as a social construct that you're talking about when you talk about white Christianity.
So I used to do anti-racism training for white people, and I found it was difficult to get them to identify with their European ethnicities. They just didn't think anymore about being, German, whatever. And I would get them to start, okay, go Irish, and they would get all hepped up about that. I said, I can never tell you Swedes apart from you Germans. You're exactly alike, the same personality, and they all laugh, ha ha ha. Or you Irish from you Belgians. You just look the same, act the same, they laugh and laugh. But you must be the same, because when you got to America, you all became white people. Because the Europeans they thought of themselves in terms of their ethnicities. It was a social construct that when they came here, they're going to be different from and better than people of color. And that was the promise they were made. So all these folks now that are, what they say, the demographic of Trump's people, they're white, less educated, a little older, and they also have stagnated wages. Their kids are being sent to ugly, stupid wars that don't work, but are killing their kids and maiming them, and they don't feel like it's their country anymore. So make America great that it really means make America white again, not great again, white again. So he's appealing directly to that sense of their being disenfranchised. Boy, am I getting some response to this notion of white privilege from a lot of those folks who don't feel very privileged. You know? So this whole notion of a construct that was a lie, I mean, it was a sin, it was a lie, it was, you know, this wasn't just a sin. Throwing away Imago Dei and making slaves less than human, claiming they were, treating them that way, telling them they were, telling each other they were, it wasn't just a sin against them, it was a sin against God.
Yeah.
A sin against God. And we still carry that original sin around with us, and it blinds us, it binds us, and let me just, white folks, we white folks, when we get uncomfortable, we feel afraid. White folks' uncomfortability makes us afraid. I got a whole chapter, a whole section called white fragility. White boy, I'll tell you, whites are feeling very fragile. I had a pastor, you know, she's a liberal, white, mainline pastor in Chicago. How can I talk about this without making my congregation feel uncomfortable? You know, and she somehow forgot that Jesus made everybody uncomfortable, particularly those in power. Then, you know, they had the whole Black Friday shopping, Michigan Avenue thing, Black Youth Project, Black Lives Matter. And this was, I was down there, I told them I was for them, I was with them, I was on their side, but it was so inconvenient. I couldn't get my iPhone. It was the only day I had to get it, you know. It was just so, you know, I said, do you have any black people in your, by the way, 75%, this is true now, 75% of white Americans have no significant black relationships in their social circles. 75%. So I said, okay, you know anybody, any friends who are black? Someday have a cup of coffee and say, are there days when racism makes you uncomfortable? Or is it ever inconveniencing? Just think how stupid you'd feel asking that question. And yet you don't want to feel uncomfortable or inconvenienced. So another pastor says, how about if we lean into our discomfort to finally, you know, begin to look at the sin. So the racial geography is, you know, when I began research on this, it was even worse than I thought. And the beloved community, Vincent Harding, who was my mentor and books dedicated to him, that's all he talked about, was this notion of the beloved community and the cloud of witnesses. You know, the cloud of witnesses, you know, Hebrews talks about those who are going to be not going to be fulfilled until we finish the job. Yeah. And we first heard Vincent speak once when he was speaking in Virginia on the people around Martin Luther King Jr. We were just starting at Sojourners, and we wanted to hear about, you know, all the movement leaders, and he talked about Sojourner Truth. He talked about people way, way back, and it was the cloud of witnesses, what he called the cheerleaders in the stands. You're in the field, in the dirt, in the mud, trying to move forward, and you know, Malcolm's up there, and Martin's up there, and Dorothy Day's up there, and how these people are cheering for you. And now Vincent's right there in the middle of my cloud of witnesses, and I wrote this book with this. I have a whole wall of the pictures of my cloud of witnesses, my family. This is our family tree Hebrews is talking about. You know, all these people who lived and died in faith, not having seen much of what they. So this is a whole different family tree than whiteness or white people. And the most controversial chapter in the book so far is chapter 5, called Dying to Whiteness, which comes from James Cone, who said years ago, repentance for white people means, Cone said it well, a long time ago, means dying to whiteness. Whiteness is this crippling, blinding, binding sin, which Jim Cohn said it well. We have to die to. So what does that mean? So that so far has been the chapter I've gotten most pushback to. But that's the heart of it, I think. So it means the geography question. It means listening and, as you said, believing the stories. Not just hearing, but believing the stories. That really can change people. It really does. It changes your perspective when all of a sudden, just one quick story. Race is a story. And so I start with mine. So I'm in Detroit in that situation, not knowing what's going on, trying to figure it out. So I go into the city and I take jobs alongside young men who were same age as me, but they're black and I'm white. And I'm making money for college and they're supporting their families. So I remember I was a janitor at Detroit Edison Company, right? And big, strong, moving furniture around, lots of fun. And I met this kid named Butch. And, we got along well and we began talking. And this is how old I am. We had elevator operators in those days. That's how old I am. And when the elevator operators were off or were sick, they put me and Butch on the elevators. Now, you got to have a break if you're riding up and down the elevator, the morning and the afternoon. So in my breaks, I'd go into his elevator and ride up and down with him. We'd just talk and talk and talk. His break would come over to mine, we'd ride up and down and talk. He always had Frantz Fanon hanging out of his khaki pockets. And we were talking about, at Detroit Edison, urban guerrilla warfare. People would get off at the next stop right away on the elevator. So he took me home for dinner, first time with his mother and his siblings. His father had passed. His mother's just like my mother. She's not militant, political, worried about her son's idea is going to get him in trouble, is what. So she told me, though, about the experience of the men in her life with the Detroit Police Department. Her grandfather, stories. Her father, her husband, and now Butch. And here's what she says to me, Butch's mother. So I tell my kids, if you ever lost, can't find your way home, and you see a policeman, duck under a stairwell, hide behind a building, wait till he passes, come out, and find your way home. When she said that, I can remember, it's 50 years ago, I remember it as vividly right now as 50 years ago. My mother's words echo in my head. If you're ever lost, can't find your way home, look for a policeman. She told all her 5 kids, look for a policeman. He's your friend. He'll take you by the hand. He'll bring you home. You're going to learn most about the world by being in places you're never supposed to be, with people you were never supposed to meet and know. That's the whole idea of this new community. And then we hear the stories and we get it. We finally listen, and then, as you put it so well, we can't keep walking away. That's the whole point. Thank you for that.
Other questions from community? Yes, ma'am.
It's for Wendy. This may just be a matter of semantics and putting the emphasis on a different syllable, but when you say until we can't walk away from it, my way of saying that would be until we won't walk away from the original sin of racism. To me, if you look at Ferguson and you go to events there, council meetings or city events or church events, you would think that white people couldn't walk away from it, but we still are. And so, but maybe you just mean it differently.
No, I mean until we can't. So, because too much of our own selves is caught up in it, right? Because I have a relationship and something happens, let's say to Starsky, that I cannot walk away because he is my brother. Not because I won't, but because I can't. It's impossible for me to do that anymore, right? Because why would I walk away from
Until
my...
you've had that internal change.
Yeah, he's my brother,
Okay.
right? Why I just cannot walk away.
Okay, I guess I'm thinking on a more meta stage where we as whites continue to choose to walk away
Yes,
from it.
and
as
I'm
an
saying
issue
we won't have the choice
until we
anymore.
have- Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Great. Reverend was the first person here today. He went preach somewhere else, grabbed him a sub sandwich, and came right over here. He's ready to go.
Well, you're really putting me on the spot. For the last several months, I and a number of other people have been part of a group that's been meeting to deal with our whiteness. And it's called Witnessing Whiteness. And the emphasis is for us to become more aware about being white, what that actually means. And we're at the point where we're starting to look at that in terms of white privilege. That part of being white goes along, part of it is that we are in fact privileged. And you've mentioned, each of you in your different talks have mentioned several ways in which we are privileged, about going into a store, about walking down the street, about having police officers relate to us differently, and all of that kind of stuff. And and for white, not having to have the talk. We had to have the talk because our middle son is black. He's adopted. But we had to have the talk with him before he left home. In fact, earlier. And we lived in the Chicago area at that time. But I noticed about 2 weeks ago, I don't know if anybody else saw it, but there was an opinion piece in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch by somebody named Ashby or Asbury or something like that. And he said, I have a big problem with this term white privilege. I mean, if it's a privilege, doesn't that mean it can be taken away? And what I have earned, I have earned. Why should now everything I have be taken away? So my related question is, and we talk about, and I think, Jim, you just said something, and I have my ears in, but I'm not sure I heard correctly, but you said we have, am I correct? You said we have to die to whiteness? Is that what I heard you say? Is that what I heard you say?
According to your code. Yes.
Okay. Because part of me says, how can you die to something if you don't know what it is? If you don't know what that whiteness is, that you may not even be aware that it has related to your whiteness. It's just, it's who I am. Yeah, I could have, aimed going to an Ivy League school as against a small college in Ohio. Sure, I could have done that. I could have done that. There's a lot of things I had a range of choices, and that's part of being white. I had options. I had directions I could go because I'm white. But if I don't connect those with that being white, how am I going to die to that? So that's kind of my question.
There's Robert Jensen, who's a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and he got a website called Beyond Whiteness. And I use him in this book. He's worth a look. Like anyone, I have overcome certain hardships in my life. I've worked hard to get where I am, and I work hard to stay there. But to feel good about myself and my work, I do not have to believe that merit as defined by white people in a white country alone got me there. I can acknowledge that in addition to all the hard work I got a significant boost from white privilege, which continues to protect me every day of my life from certain hardships. He goes on to say how he wanted to see himself as a heroic, rugged, individual American, but he was afraid that maybe he didn't really deserve all his success, that maybe it had more to do with luck than brains and hard work, and he wasn't so special. So how do you deal with your sense of hard work and success and not acknowledge the context in which you're in? So he's really helpful in explaining all this. White fragility, though, comes from this notion that we're really afraid to look at how the context of whiteness, the rightness of whiteness, or let's call it the assumed entitlement of whiteness, or the normality of whiteness. So last week in South Africa, there was a retreat. We're very involved with a number of young South African leaders. It was a retreat for mostly people of color around the world. Lisa Sharon Harper from our shop was there. And there were just a handful of whites, mostly South Africans. And she said at the end, they asked for 10 volunteers to frame the discussion and define what the outcomes were. 6 of the 10 who volunteered were white. And if you know Lisa, she's one of the volunteers.
Yeah.
And she's not white. So in that group, it began to be clear that these are white, progressive South Africans, enough so they'd be invited to a retreat on Robben Island with people of color. And the assumption that they could figure this out. The assumption that, yeah, now they get it, now they see the analysis, now they're on the right side, now they're, but I think I could figure this out. So that's what, when people say we got to stand down from that assumption of thinking that you should dominate the leadership space.
Yeah.
Can I add something to that? I'm currently working on a curriculum with John Dorhauer, most of you know him, on white privilege. And the first assignment, the first chapter, is about telling your spiritual autobiography through the lens of race. And I've been wrestling with that as I'm even sitting in this beautiful sanctuary. And when I pay attention to the stained glass windows in this sanctuary, they're beautiful. I've seen them often, I'm here often. But I don't see myself anywhere. Nowhere. I don't even see my children included in the lap of Jesus. And this is normal. I have no belief that these windows were created to be a heartbreak to me. People create God in their own image. And the people who have had the means to create images of God did not look like me. But this word privilege sometimes becomes troublesome, even for our accomplices. So I would like to share with you something that I wrote for my accomplice after a difficult conversation. When I call out your white privilege, I am not dismissing your presence in this struggle, nor am I questioning your sincerity. When I call out your white privilege, I am not accusing you of the evil, nor am I separating you from its effects. When I call out your white privilege, I am not shrouding you in shame, nor am I shielding you from your responsibility or accountability. When I call out your white privilege, I am naming the target that is on your back. I am acknowledging the ill effect of racism on your being. I am joining you to the struggle in the only way that leads to liberation. When I call out your white privilege, I am acknowledging this privilege as being as unearned, unwarranted, and incapacitating as the racist systems and structures that collude to oppress people of color all over this world. When I call out your white privilege, I sound the alarm of the danger that lurks in not being fully aware of the toxic waters in which we swim. Waters that make you feel as though you are breathing so that you never come up for air. When I call out your white privilege, it is not because I believe you can remove it alone, not because I believe you can choose to use it or refuse it. If these things were true, it would be privilege indeed, but it is not. It is a tool of the enemy designed to create an illusion of God divided against God's self. Crafted so that some might assume the idolatrous position of believing somehow that anyone created in the image of God could ever be inherently flawed. When I call it out, white privilege, it is not because I hate you. It is not to separate you. It is to remind you and myself that we are one.
As we go to these last
You used a word there I want to just lift up. Sometimes we get stuck between shame and guilt. The word you lifted up was responsibility.
Yeah.
How do you separate guilt from responsibility? The principle is simply this: if we benefit from oppression, we are responsible for changing it. That's a very fundamental principle that we have to affirm. And this is what we need our brothers and sisters for in the churches, who will see our blindness and really are trying to help us get our souls back as white Christians. That's really the power of relationship here. That's as good as I've ever heard it said. It's about our responsibility for changing, and implicit bias is something we all got to learn a lot more about. There's a whole section in the book about implicit bias, where not even police departments are full of implicit bias and explicit bias. How do we understand both at a much deeper level?
As we, on this point, and before we take these last couple of questions, I want to ask those who are at the table in the back, there are a couple of cards. There are two things that are here. There's some cards that speak to a web resource at Sojo with articles on white privilege, implicit bias, and the like, that we want to make accessible to people. So for those beloved disciples who are at the table, they're little black cards. If we could get those circulating among the people who are still with us. And also there's a sign-up list for emails, resources from Sojo on this topic. So if we could circulate those clipboards as well, and invite people, if they want more resources for this dialogue, to put their email address on that list. We'll just circulate those throughout the audience so we can get more information. I saw you all battling it out, so you decide who goes next.
My name's Colleen Gilmore, and I come from Peace, UCC, and we're so happy to have Wendy. So many things are going on inside of me that I felt like I needed to speak. So I came from a family of, I consider very racist comments through my life as a child, and at the time not thinking much of it, not understanding, just hearing it. And then my life evolved, went to nursing school, came out of nursing school and started doing home care. In fact, Yolanda and I know each other from years back. And one of the things you all shared about is to get past that that feeling of differentness is to be with other people and to learn about other people. And I feel like I've been a nurse for 32 years and caring for people in St. Louis in all walks of life, and it has helped me immensely to break through and to realize how strong racism was, that I heard these stories. What's affecting me now is that my partner and I adopted a child 14 years ago who's from Guatemala. That decision came after lots of thinking, and because of our family and white privilege, and being concerned about what it would be like for two white women to raise an African American child, our white privilege took us to another country, which I'm very proud that I have my son, but I'm not very proud about making that decision when there are African American children that I know that we would love and raise, and my parents would come a long way. They already have come a long way. What I'm finding with generations of change is that I cannot stand to be around a table with my father and my mother not as much, when a comment will come across about, did you hear about that black man, or did you hear, Jonathan's friend is Jewish, is he going over to that Jewish boy's house again? I said, no, he's going to Brandon's house, Mom. And I'll hear her say something about a black man, and I'll say, he's a man, he has a name. I am so verbal now. I'm so angry when they say things like that, because I tell them when my son's not in the room, I say, you don't realize, but you have a grandson of color. They don't see that it affects him, and he has a lot of issues that he's working through about being different. And so I'm imagining some of the things what Wendy said. We've lost his green card. We need to get his green card. When we were thinking about going on vacation, now he's 14. We don't have proof of his citizenship. We're staying away from the border. We're staying away from Texas and Arizona, all those places. But a lot of things that you shared touched me and make me feel about taking it a step further. Not just around the table with my family. I've seen things change from that generation of my grandparents. My grandparents refused to leave Baden. They're not going to leave Baden. Now my dad's refusing to leave where he is. He feels very comfortable, but then he'll still make a comment that I'm like, really? He says, I have no problem in my neighborhood. I have all black neighbors. We all live together, everything's fine. And then I'll hear a comment at Thanksgiving, and I'm like, what's this about? So we do struggle. You come from where you come from. You grow up hearing these stories. But I do see through the generations things changing in some families where it's not as prevalent. But now that's a different family than ours, I'm sure, based on what some of the things you share. So I'm not sure if it's a question, but I really appreciate what you all shared. And it just brought out a lot of things. Do you see things changing generation, as time goes on in your work? But thank you.
Thank you.
Jeanette Mott Oxford from Empower, Missouri. We're a not-for-profit that's been around since 1901 and under 4 names, but 1 mission, social justice. And I'm a member of Epiphany United Church of Christ. On Martin Luther King Sunday, I was asked to preach at Elliott Chapel, Unitarian Church, where 150 people have been reading the book Waking Up White, and that's a wonderful thing. And I hear, many in the congregation talking about, those gathered here today, a new focus on looking at white privilege, which is a wonderful thing. And I'm aware that, you were at DR4 with me, right? I get mixed up about who was what year, but if it hadn't been for that 6-day institute where I looked at my whiteness and where I learned about my internalized privilege and others had internalized oppression, and that I had areas in my life where I have internalized oppression, not just privilege, and that we're intersectional people. I learned about that in a 6-day institute that's made me the advocate that I am today. Maybe I wouldn't be doing what I am in our state capitol. So it's really important that we do that. But I want to urge people who are working on their personal stuff right now, while they've got that one eye looking in within, please keep the other eye on our state capitol. I don't know if you know that there were over 20 bills heard this last week that relate very dramatically to race and class and gender, including photo voter ID that would disenfranchise over 200,000 Missourians, mainly people of color, women, transgender folks. So please keep an eye on the Capitol too, or get on our email list so that we can let you know what's happening, so that while you're doing the personal work, that's absolutely important, don't give that up, that's got to happen, so that you can speak out at the right time. Here's one of the bills that we testified on recently, a bill that would basically punish you with a fine if you went to the emergency room inappropriately, or if you missed your medical appointment, because poor people are so irresponsible. So we were the only group testifying against this bill. No one testified for it, which doesn't mean it won't go somewhere, because lots of bills pass in our state capitol with no one testifying for them. We were the only group testifying against it, and I said, it could be that you really meant to keep your medical appointment the day you made the appointment, but you drive a real old car that won't start on a cold day because your battery's real old. Or you got an eviction notice right before your medical appointment, and it seemed a little more important to keep a roof over your kids' heads, so you're out going to dozens of agencies begging for help to keep your rent paid on the day of your medical appointment. So it might not be your irresponsibility that made you miss your appointment, but rather your hyper-responsibility toward your family that made you miss that medical appointment. And I said, in matters of all of these bills that are about punishing poor people into behaving, the beatings will continue until your morale improves, as Glenn Keenan, our Hunger Task Force chair, puts it. The most helpful things in the Bible to me are Exodus 1 and 2. The story of the taking away the straw seems to me to be a perfect metaphor for welfare deform in our country. And that we have to remember that story begins with the line, "Then a king arose who did not know Joseph." And when we do not know the people we are making public policy about, we will get it wrong every time.
Yeah.
And people in our state capitol only trust certain voices, like the Foundation for Government Accountability, a Koch brothers founded organization that tells them 30% of people on welfare are committing fraud. They will not believe statistics from the University of Michigan that says that the number of children living on less than $2 per person per day has gone up by 140% since 1996, the welfare reform law. Your willingness to believe is about who says it. And we've chosen up sides. So don't take that other eye off of our state capitol. Important things are happening. At least help a group like Empower Missouri have a little more capacity to address it while people are doing their personal work. Both are very important, and let's keep them both going.
Amen. Thanks, Jeanette. We'll make this our last comment or question, and then we'll ask these kind of conversation leaders whether they had any closing reflection.
Hi. Hello. I wanted to ask a question about power and privilege, specifically how those two come together. My name is Peter Armstrong. I work for Christ Church Cathedral through the Episcopal Service Corps. And I'm wondering, this question might be best to you, Reverend Tracy. I want to be an accomplice. I want to use my privilege as a white, straight, tall man to make it so that you don't have to tell these stories as a black woman over and over again. And yet, as someone, especially as someone who's thinking about, possibly about to start the discernment process for priesthood, I realize I will possibly have a lot of power that comes from my privilege in my future life. And I want to use that power for good, so that the present situation of how my privilege affects my power no longer continues to be the case. But I wonder if that use of power in some way perpetuates the status quo of keeping that power in my hands and not yours, if I'm the one who's using that. And it's something I'm struggling with and trying to figure out what to do about it.
When I speak of privilege, I understand privilege to be something that is in this particular context of isms. I understand privilege to be something that is unearned and unwarranted. Today we're talking about white privilege, but I certainly have privilege as well. I have privilege as a straight woman. I have privilege as clergy. I have some class privilege that I have to wrestle with all the time. When we talk about power, that which comes from privilege and that which comes from acceleration with or without privilege, the caution that I give is that power itself does not have to be bad. It's how we use the power. So when I say I'm tired of telling my stories, I do realize that I'm the only one who should tell my story. And an appropriate use of power is to create space at the table for others to tell their story. An inappropriate use of power is to assume that I need to be spoken for or represented in a way outside of myself. And so even in this work of dismantling racism that I find myself in right now, I deal with a lot of power around ageism. I get invited to tables and then get invited to places where people are afraid to allow millennials to come. People are afraid of the ones they saw on TV. I'm just gonna be honest, yes. Right? Yeah. And so I get invited because I don't have a "not your respectable Negro" shirt. Somebody up here does, but I don't.
And wear it proudly.
And so what power, using that power appropriately for me looks like is to not accept those invitations on behalf of millennials. Not to speak on behalf of millennials as though because I've been out there that I know their story, but to require that space be made at the table for everyone. I've been wrestling with this notion, which I think gets at what you're asking me, of a welcome table. We in the UCC have made a mantra out of the extravagant welcome, that our churches are welcoming, that our tables are welcome, that everyone is welcome. But I'm asking myself the question, does not the assumption that I have the authority to welcome people imply ownership of the table itself? Does not the assumption that I have to open the door for you imply an inequity in power? And so my suggestion is that we all must become simultaneously host and guest. And those of us who have power through having the voice or the look or the connections that make people listen, refuse to go alone. Use that power in the Episcopal Church to create space for those who are not present. Not that they be at your mercy or at my mercy, but recognize that we're all there by grace.
Yeah.
And the fact that you ask that question and the fact that you're willing to wrestle with it makes me excited that you are discerning that call.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. We must give one another permission to fail sometimes. Permission to get it wrong. Permission to say the wrong thing. And be vulnerable enough to have the conversations so that we can get it right. So many people in Ferguson were incapacitated by their fear of not wanting to be called a racist. I know that. So many of our churches were frozen because if we do the wrong thing, people are going to call us that. And that's what that writing was about. We are all swimming in toxic waters. Everybody. It just shows up differently. So thank you for wrestling. Get you some friends who don't look like you. You probably already have some. You got some? Okay. Some friends who don't look like you, who don't think like you, who make you a little uncomfortable, as Jim says, but who are willing to be your accomplice on this journey. And when you get it wrong, they'll let you know.
Good deal. So we'll invite some final thoughts here. I'm not going to go in front of Wendy again. I'm going to ask Wendy to share, and then I'll share, and then Tracy, and then give Jim the last word for this aspect in this setting of this conversation that we hope is an ongoing conversation with you, in as much as it will be for Jim and for Jim and the whole team of Sojourners who are taking this conversation. Atlanta next, right? Going to Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta on Sunday, and we'll be continuing this conversation that we hope you follow. So any closing thoughts, Reverend Bruner, and then I'll share.
You know, I'll just tell one more story, and it's a story of a young Mennonite girl who crossed the border from Canada to the United States. It's much easier, let me just tell you that, to come from the north than it is to come from the south. I had no problems at all. But I remember I was going to Atlanta, and I was a volunteer with the Mennonite church. I was living in community, and I was very excited. And I remember thinking, this is such an adventure to go to Atlanta, to the inner city. I'm from rural Saskatchewan, so I'm just going to say it's a big change. And I was called out on that. It was an adventure for me, but I was walking into somebody's community. And it was not an adventure for them to live every day in the way that they were living. And I had such privilege that I could step away from what I was doing and spend, as it turned out, 7 years as a volunteer with the Mennonite church, because I didn't have a family to provide for or any of that. But it was not an adventure. I was a guest in a community, and I think sometimes, first of all, I'm grateful for the person who called me out on that. Talk about making mistakes. It was life-changing for me because I recognized that that folks graciously accepted me into their community, and they didn't have to. This white farm girl just waltzed right in, and I expected that everybody would think I was awesome, right? And so that's also privilege, let me just tell you that, right? That you expect that everybody's gonna love and trust you just because you're so nice. So I think that, that just thinking about things in that way, it's not an adventure to go into the inner city and do whatever it is that you're going to do. So as church people, I would just suggest we really carefully think about that. We are guests in a community where people struggle every day. It's no adventure. And so that's just, I was just thinking about that, Tracy, when you said it's okay to make mistakes, and it's good for, it's humbling also to admit that you've made many of them yourself. So I'm just going to close with that.
Okay. Well, thank Reverend Bruner. She is awesome, by the way. I know this. I wanted to, again, close with thanks to Jim for being here, for sharing in this conversation with us in this community, and for all of you for being here. Again, I'll also plug two things, as these will be my final words. Number one, Jim's book. You can get that in the narthex in the back. And number two, to join us tomorrow night at 7 p.m. at Christ the King United Church of Christ on Old Halls Ferry Road, where Reverend Dr. Jim Forbes will be leading us in the annual Black History lecture there as this conversation continues. I'll close with some context around my thoughts, 2 thoughts and invitations about what to do with white privilege. I didn't respond to that question earlier. And I put it in context. Tracy and I served together this week. We were together in Chicago because we're on the board of Chicago Theological Seminary. And on Tuesday, if you're on the Twitter or the Facebook or the Instagram, Chicago Theological Seminary put out a YouTube video that I invite you to Google. This white privilege glasses. White privilege glasses, or search the hashtag to continue to have a conversation about what white privilege. The video takes you into an experience of what white privilege could be like. And then there's an opportunity to continue conversations about it. You can even, if you want, if you shoot me an email, I'll send you a pair of white privilege glasses. I've got some in my office. But we had this conversation with the president there, Allison, about what to do with white privilege. I want to offer 2 things that I didn't get to share in that space. Number 1, engage your white privilege in systematic deference. Systematic deference. I connect this to the writing of Dr. Alan Busak and Curtis DeYoung about radical reconciliation, where they describe the situation of the early church as an intentionally diverse community where people who had privilege, privilege in Roman society, privilege in the wider context of the empire, decided to systematically give away that privilege and take up apprenticeship under marginalized Jews, who were the disciples there left as apostles. And so we get to the first century church is there because of people who systematically defer and not only go to be with people who are marginalized, but actually take leadership from people who are marginalized. If you really want to know how to kill your privilege, then I think one of the things that you must engage in is systematic deference of that privilege, giving it away, shooting it off. The other issue is strategic deployment, which Reverend Blackman spoke to a little bit. There are times in which that privilege can create space for other people. So part of the question is not as much do I have privilege, but maybe it's a metric assessment every now and then, an evaluation. What have I been doing with my privilege lately? Have I been using it to create space for other people? Have I been using it to open doors such that people could share in ways that they would not be able to share otherwise? And then I really will fall on Jim's question. Am I more white than Christian? And quite frankly, I mean, there are more white people here tonight, but I mean, there's some black folk who can ask this question too, of themselves and of how they live their lives. Because if whiteness actually is a social construct and not an ethnicity, then we can begin to live our whiteness no matter our skin color. And so I think it's helpful for us, based upon the social construct that is whiteness in America and the privileges and punishments that we have redounded to such, that we can all ask ourselves every now and again, particularly in the Protestant mainline where the culture is white as much as it is Christian. Am I now more white than Christian? What does that assessment say about me this week, this day, this month, this year in my life of discipleship? Would be helpful questions for all of us.
I'll join my sister and say, yes, we all do make faux pas. And so I'm going to lift up one for the sake of the team, so you all won't make this faux pas. Jeanette Mock-Osford gave reference to a Dismantling Racism Institute that I don't think is offered here anymore, but that we had the privilege of going through at the same time, which was 6 days of deep diving into multiple levels of oppression. And it was in that workshop, in that intensive, that I first came really face to face with my straightness. And it was like an awakening that everyone did not share my privilege around that for multiple reasons. And I got so eager. I had a friend who is same-gender loving, and I started asking him every question that I ever wanted to know. I would wake up in the middle of the night and I'd think about something. And I would call him, because he was my friend, and say, you know, so tell me this, or tell me this. And he allowed me, by grace, to do that for about a month and a half. And one day I must have called at the exact wrong moment with one of my questions. And he said to me something that changed my life, and I'm going to offer it to you on the front end. He said, Tracy, my dear sister, I love you dearly, and I'm happy that you have been awakened. But your need to know does not create in me a need to educate. Therefore, if you're really committed to doing this work, do your work. Go and read. Go and research. Go and see what's out there. And then the questions you cannot find answers to, come and have a conversation with me. I invite you to do the same. Don't ask me about slavery. It's in books. Don't ask me about mass incarceration. Michelle Alexander did a pretty good job. Ask me the questions that arise after you've done some work. Because if we're committed to getting free, it's going to take some work. It's going to take some unlearning and some learning. And that's going to mean an investment of your time and your resources. Don't just listen to Jim's Cliff Notes. Read his book. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Because if you Facebook me, I'm going to ask you, did you do your work? Just as people have asked me. And my final thing is, go Panthers.
Well, I just want to agree with some of the stuff you just heard strongly. On the deference question, we were in a session with pastors in Minneapolis. A whole bunch of pastors came out in short notice to talk about this, and there were a lot of kind of white pastors and even some bishops and people who wanted to deal with this, and this young African American, I don't think he's even a pastor, he said, I just got a question for all of you. How many of you who really want to deal with this, how many of you have somebody in your life who's mentoring you that's a person of color? Who's teaching, mentoring, help to form you, who's the person of color? Didn't even get into all the, who's the pastor and all that, but who, if you're not even being mentored by anybody, and which is what Tracy was just saying, the whole, white folks like to talk about everything. Talk. And it's not only just we want other people to educate us, but there's a whole thing in our tradition about walking while we talk, So if we're not engaged in changing this criminal justice system and the policing and voter restoration and fixing a broken immigration, you don't have to understand everything to act on what you know. And there's going to have to be some multiracial truth-telling and some multiracial campaigning around fixing those policy things. And I love the notion of space, and I want to finish with toxicity, space. I was thinking the same thing all morning, preaching about the stained windows. You didn't put those in.
No.
I know that.
They were here when I got here.
I know that, but the normality.
Yeah.
The normality, and we white folks often don't, because it feels normal to us.
Yeah.
We don't see the normality, and we don't understand how other people can't see themselves in our normality. So the space question. I think we white folks assume that we own the space, or that we control the space, or at least now that we're progressive, we can figure out how to lead the space. And I have seen Reverend Blackman here. I've seen her create space time and time again, particularly for young people who a lot of folks would like her to speak for. And one of the things we all have is we have influence in spaces. What's a space that you have influence in? Could be religious, could be workplace, school. Are you open? Are you helping that space be open? Are you inviting new people and voices into that space? What we do with a space where we have influence is really important. And to not speak for other people, and not speak in a space where you might be listened to and they wouldn't be. What does it mean to open, create, allow, and support, and do deference to other voices in that space? Space support. Last thing, Flint is such a parable right now. The toxicity, as Reverend Tracy put it, the toxicity of racism in the waters of the country, in the air that we breathe. It's that toxicity that we have to understand for what it is. It isn't just, here's a list of issues and problems. It's the very air we breathe and the water that we drink. And those 8,000 kids have not been the only people poisoned. And poisoned in all kinds of ways. So what does it mean to be committed to cleaning up the water and the air? For us to clean up the water and the air together. That's the only way to build a bridge toward a different kind of future. And I love what Heather McGee said in the first meeting. She said, to aim at a country where privilege and punishment are not the consequences of our skin color. So when I asked Brian Stevenson to write this forward, I said, don't write about the book, write about an essay on this topic. And I want you to read that essay. He starts with a story that he's told me at length about when, this is a Harvard lawyer, Supreme Court advocate, Brian Stevenson, wrote the most powerful book on criminal justice. It's a Starbucks book now. He's going home from work one night, parks his car outside his house in Atlanta. He's had a long day. He's gotten 110 people off death row. He won the battle against putting children in solitary confinement and life sentences in the Supreme Court. And he's tired. He's got his legal briefs all over the front seat for more work at night. And he's just tired, so he's listened to some music. He told me it was Sly. He's listened to some Sly. Put his head back against the headrest and closed his eyes just for a few minutes before going up to his house. Banging on the door, banging on his passenger window, startled, looks up, here's a white cop with a gun, yelling at him, get out of the effing car or I'll blow off your effing head. But he didn't abbreviate it. Brian Stevenson gets out of the car, explains he's a lawyer, hands up, not reaching for nothing, spread eagles over the car in front of his neighbors. Takes a long time doing it. Finally, in the end, has to check and figures out he is a lawyer named Brian Stevenson. It is his house. He would just sit in the car in front of his house. Does the cop say, I'm sorry? He says, you're lucky this time. You're lucky this time. This is happening now. Every day. All day long. It's toxicity. It's a sin. It's time to repent of that sin and turn around and go in a whole different direction.
Amen.